as I remember, the idea was actually from Clem Valance, who had the idea for Around the World in 80 Days. And we really weren't going to do a follow-up to Around the World in 80 Days. It was a once-off. I went back to acting, and I made a film called American Friends, and appeared in Alan Bleasdale's GBH after Around the World in 80 Days. And I thought, well, that's what I do. Travel was just a one-off. But it had made quite a big impact Around the World in 80 Days, and people seem to know about it. On the street, people always ask you, off again, Mike, or if you wherever, anywhere, showed the slightest hesitation about where you were going. So, lost again, got round the world, can't get across Oxford Street and all that. And there seemed to be an expectation that I should do another journey. So I think Clem and I just kept in touch, had lunch every now and then, looked at a few maps, and I quite liked the idea of going north-south, and we discussed that. But it was Clem Valance who came up, I think, with the idea of pole to pole, certainly of the line going down 30 degrees east longitude, because it went through, the most land surface. I mean, that was quite a crucial decision about pole to pole was the route. Because if you went north to south just directly, it's mostly water, so it would have been the world's most boring series, sort of 35 different kinds of fish, and that's it. So that was Clem, I say, who had the idea of going 30 degrees east. I was very relieved that Around the World in 80 Days worked as well as it did, because we were all unsure quite what would turn out of this documentary that had no script and had me rushing around the world. The fact that it had been very popular in terms of audience, and also that the book had sold amazingly well, made me feel, well, we've achieved something. There's obviously something about this kind of travel that people relate to. So I don't think I ever felt that's it, I never want to travel again. I think my only feeling was, how do we do another one? And Around the World in 80 Days was based on a book. It had a story, it had a life, that we hadn't given it. The life was given it by Jules Verne and his story. So, and there was nothing else quite like that. So I think I was very, very wary of just doing a follow-up for the sake of doing a follow-up. And I think certainly for 18 months or so, I resisted, as did we all, the idea of trying to do a sequel, because there didn't seem to be a sequel. But then, as I've said, there seemed to be such a sort of popular enthusiasm for the kind of show that 80 Days was, that people are almost sort of expectantly waiting for something else. And that's what made me feel, well, perhaps it is worth doing. And certainly as far as the travel went, I was still very, very enthusiastic about that. I'd never done anything quite like Around the World in 80 Days on that sort of scale. And so, I was a bit sort of putty in the hands of a nice map or an atlas. Look, all these places, I could go there, and the BBC might pay me to go there. It was sort of the possibilities were rather attractive. Yes, we learned one or two things from Around the World in 80 Days. A really key thing was that the things that worked best were just encounters, very often the sort of quick, casual, unset up, improvised encounters with people. And the things that didn't work were the set up, formalised interviews. And on 80 Days, there were a number of pieces which have, since hit the cutting room floor, like a long interview with a Turkish gentleman about politics in Turkey. I remember that. One or two interviews with ship's captains about sort of the role of shipping in the modern world and all that sort of thing. And I think probably because I found those rather stiff and formal, they didn't particularly work. And what I liked best was just sort of meeting people and as much as possible, ordinary folk, not the politicians, not the people with a line to sell, but people whose lives we impinged upon. And certainly the most successful episode of Around the World in 80 Days, I think, in terms of audience response, was when we were on the Dow. And we were just stuck on this Dow. It looked very unpromising to start with, no radar, no sex and all that sort of thing. And our lives in the hands of these Gujarati fishermen, very few of whom could speak English. But it turned into a magical sequence of people trying to understand each other and frequently succeeding. So I think we did feel that interesting people in unusual locations was the formula that worked best. And we were wasting our time if we got a sort of ordinary study and, somebody going on 15 minutes about the world situation. That was going to be a waste of time. So I think we felt that being on the move and shooting as spontaneously as possible was what was working. And as I say, very often it was just it was worth taking risks. Sometimes in 80 days we thought, well, we better prepare this. We better tell them what I'm going to ask them if they can hand the ticket over in a certain way. More traditionally sort of documentary approach. And I think we decided you don't need to do that. Sometimes you can just go in there and wing it and hope something will come of it, and spontaneity works best. And I was always rather like that. I never really liked doing second takes of anything because I miss the sort of moment when you struggle to make communication, or you sort of drink something you probably shouldn't have drunk. I mean, it happens once, and that's I find the best time to get it. So we learnt that from 80 days. This was what worked, and also I think that 80 days, oddly enough, was actually one of the most relaxed things we've done. Although there were moments of intense pressure, there were also 12 days on a boat going across the Pacific where we barely filmed anything because there wasn't that much to film. And I think we felt when we did Pole to Pole that we could maximise our sort of our work and our output more by just having fewer days when there's nothing happening, and try and make sure you're in places where something is bound to happen. And that's been the pattern since of all the programmes. And I think that was something we learnt from 80 days. Use the time. Don't sort of get stuck in a situation where you can't film for several days, because that's a waste of everybody's time and effort. The one area that concerned us with Pole to Pole was whether we could recreate this time constraint, these deadlines, the feeling of deadline that 80 days was all about. And I think we honestly felt that was our most vulnerable point about the whole new journey, was that people would miss this. So we tried to recreate it. We had day numbers, which we still use actually quite effectively, on the bottom of the screen. We'll have those. We'll try and create some sort of deadlines within the journey itself. Michael's got to get to a certain place to get a ship at a certain time. The rainy seasons are coming. He's got to get out of Sudan at this time and all that. So we over-egged those a bit, although in the case of the South African supply ship to the pole, that was genuinely a real setback. But there were slightly, I remember thinking of slightly false goals. Because Around the World in 80 Days was a story, and it was there, and it was 80 days, and that's that. Pole to Pole in, whatever it was, 253 days doesn't really mean anything. But we kind of tried to, play up the various deadline situations at various points during the journey, and that Michael's got to move on. And in many cases that was true. I mean, any journey you make like that, crossing lots of different borders, you have a lot of problems. You can't plan the whole thing out in advance and hope it's going to work like clockwork. You're going to lots of different countries with different governments, different administrations, different security situations, different passport requirements. So you are going to come very often to situations where people say, sorry, we can't do it today, come back next month, and we have to argue our way through that. So there were certain moments within the journey that were deadlines that we sort of had to meet. But we played those up very much, trying to hang on to the day thing in 80 days. And the huge relief at the end of Pole to Pole, when it went out, was that it didn't seem to matter a damn. We still got the audiences we got for 80 days. And I think people seemed to accept, well, yes, there were moments when there was time problems, but basically they just were fascinated and interested in the number of countries we went through and the people we met and the cultures. So in a sense, the sort of day deadlines, the time deadline became less important. But having said that, we had to shoot the whole thing, it was about 5 months, I think. We had about a 10-day break, no less than that, about 4 or 5 day break at Aswan when one of the boats didn't leave. So it was actually quite tight, and we're always, you're working to a budget, and you have to keep moving. So there was in a sense no let up. It was just as tough as doing 80 days. In fact, much more so. 1991 was an extraordinary year for change, and that was the year we were travelling, and we were travelling through a lot of the countries that had changed. The major change, of course, was that the Soviet Union was still in existence when we went through Russia, well, what's now Russia, Ukraine and Belarus. It was all part of the Soviet Union. And it was quite unthinkable at the time that the Soviet Union would collapse within the near future. I mean, no, I don't think anybody really realised that. There were some problems. It was a bit wobbly. But the fact that we went through in July and in interviews with Ukrainians who said, one day, we will have our country back. Not in my lifetime, maybe not in my children's lifetime, but one day. They had their country back by December. I mean, that was extraordinary. And then it got down south to Ethiopia, where Mengistu was a very, very repressive dictator, a very cruel dictator, had been in power for a long time. He'd just been kicked out by a sort of citizen army of young teenagers from up in the north. So that was a major change of situation in Ethiopia. Zambia, we get in there on the day that Kenneth Kaunda loses power after 26 years. And then South Africa, where apartheid was beginning to sort of collapse. I mean, it still was sort of official policy, but it was beginning to change. Within a couple of years, Mandela came out and all that. So an extraordinary year of not just governments, but whole systems sort of collapsing. And I mean, I'm not taking credit for it, but the places we went through, they sort of seemed to collapse behind us. Oh, sorry about that. Yes. Not our fault. But it made, it gave a little extra element of excitement to all the countries. Especially Ethiopia, where there was a real sense of celebration. And I think if we'd gone to Ethiopia a year before, we just wouldn't have got the interviews. We wouldn't have got the upbeat sort of feeling, the excitement that was in the air that we got when we went through. And the same with Zambia. So it was coincidental that we actually chose one of the most momentous years in history, I think, to go through Africa and Russia.
How many of the 23 toasts in Novgorod do you actually remember?
Novgorod is no. Well, I just have to do what I'm asked to do. If I'm asked to appear at a banquet in Russia, I know there are going to be a few vodka toasts. It's just that there's going to be one toast for each person, and there's going to be a follow-up toast. And when you see the table filling up with about 10 or 12 people, it's going to be a heavy evening. And the vodka was not, as I remember, legal vodka. It was all illicitly brewed in his garage. So, I mean, this is quite potent stuff. And I just lay back and thought of England. And I don't know, around about 18 vodkas, I think I was kind of fairly mellow. Unfortunately, it was one of those moments when you wish you had the camera still running, because next morning I woke up with absolutely awful headache, and had to change rooms in the night because a big party official was coming to the hotel, so the room I had was being set aside for him, so I was put in a sort of downstairs room, and I was slightly disoriented, and I got up and I just had to, something had to come out, so I rushed to the basin, as one does, and I sort of clung to the side of the basin. I was just about to throw up when I looked down and I realised that the basin's not attached to anything. I'm looking right through the plug hole, and all I can see is my feet. I think, oh, God, and it was such a shock, so I reeled back, and the basin came away from the wall. So I'm staggering around this little hotel room with a basin, looking for somewhere to throw up, trying to find a little hole in the ground. And it was wonderful, actually. In the end, I didn't. Such a strange moment that I managed to control myself. But I just wish if Nigel had the camera there then, we would have got some quite unique footage. Well, I think if these people like Patrick Walker and the Witch Doctor had predicted good luck, we'd have told them to do a second take, Well, we don't want that at all. Bad news is much better to work on. But actually, they did both say there were going to be problems ahead. And I don't really believe in all that sort of stuff. I thought, well, what will be, will be. But actually, we did have some quite nasty moments on the journey as a whole. More so than any of the others I remember. The very first landing at the North Pole was one of the scariest things I've ever done. One of the few moments where I really felt that I shouldn't be doing this. This is irresponsible, not fair to my family and friends and the crew and all that, bringing them up here just to go from pole to pole, when we were trying to land on a moving ice floe, which had ridges on it, so the plane could have turned over. It was all bad news there, but we fingers crossed, we got down and were able to do that. And then there were other moments. I think there was that kind of feeling in the Soviet Union of a slightly sort of a tension, something not right. People sort of very unhappy about the way things were. And that was sort of buzzing around. Then, of course, in Sudan, we were not allowed to go south of Khartoum because of the civil war, and we managed to get these Eritreans to take us across the border, and that was a memorable 24 hours where we tried to struggle through these roads which were already rain had fallen. They were deeply pitted and rutted, and the tracks were difficult, and the vehicles kept getting stuck, and we kept having to pull them out. It was probably the worst 24 hours filming I can remember in terms of sort of discomfort, and also the feeling, where are we going? We're stuck in the middle of fields, we've lost the track, no one seemed sure where the border was, or even if we were going to be able to cross it when we got there. So that was it was kind of very difficult period, and the morale sort of got quite low then. So there was a certain pattern, and then we went to interview the witch doctor, or the healer, I should say. He's a healer as far as they're concerned. This is much better medicine than what you get from Roche Chemicals or the international drug companies. So maybe they're right. Anyway, he was a rather sort of strange-looking character, and he did say that I'd lose my money and possessions and all that sort of thing. And within a few days, things did begin to go very wrong. Almost that. The night after I saw this Dr. Biella, I had this terrible kind of semi-fever, which I've never had before, real hot and cold sweats. I've never had that. It came on very, very quickly, and most of the night I was just either shivering or I was very, very hot. Again, couldn't get this on camera because Nigel was quite rightly asleep, and I was shivering on the only loo in the place, this camp. And then I sort of got over that gradually, and we moved on. Then some bags were being sent on by Zambian Airways, something like that, just went missing and were never found. And that's the only time I've ever lost gear on the whole journey. And then we went whitewater rafting in the Zambezi River, at the end of which I was persuaded to get out of the raft and swim down the last rapid, and hit rocks underneath the water quite hard, and in the end cracked 2 ribs. This was all within a very short time of meeting Dr. Biella. And Dr. Biella had said to me, I'd asked him, is there anything I can do, if these curses or these problems will occur? And he said, he gave me a bit of tree bark, and he said, here's some tree bark. He said, just grind this up into powder, rub it all over your body and wash it off, and you'll be okay. And so, I thought, joke. And after all these things had happened, I've got this tree bark. I found it in the bottom of the bag, and I got it out when no one was looking, and I sort of ground it up a bit and put it onto my back and washed it off. And after that, things were fine. So, but actually they weren't fine, because, of course, the sting in the tail was not being able to get the boat out of Cape Town. Actually, another thing that we were that we learned from 80 Days and wanted to carry on was always travelling on the surface, if at all possible, not to take planes unless we absolutely had to. And that's why I wanted to call it originally pole to pole by public transport. But that was very important to us, to give the idea of surface travel. And so, somehow having to cheat at the end, go to South South America and then down to the South Pole that way seemed a real setback. So that was another thing that went wrong and was not the way we saw things. So yes, there were actually quite a number of moments in the journey which quite sort of difficult. The problem with me is I'm a bit impulsive, and part of my life is very, very safe and organised, and then there are certain moments where I do very silly things, and I know this will happen, as long as I live. And whitewater rafting was fine. It was jumping out of the whitewater raft on the Zambezi, which was a silly thing to do. And the reason it happened was that we'd filmed quite exciting and dramatic whitewater rafting, going speeding down, and this terrific torrents coming in, totally submerged at certain points. But it's really exciting, great thrill, and I felt perfectly safe. Then the camera was put away, we'd finished the filming, and the people I was with a group of Zimbabweans, and they just said, oh yeah, a great thing is to swim down a rapid, this last rapid, just swim down it. I said, aren't there rocks under there? They said, oh, no, absolutely no. I mean, they're a long way down. So I wait on the back of this rubber dinghy, and the guy who's in charge tells people when to go. Right, go. He says, go, and you just drop off the back and just... And so I dropped off, and I sort of tumbled down under the water, quite a long way down, and I felt this sharp jab into my back on the right-hand side there, and I knew I'd hit a rock, and I just was so I was so indignant because I knew there were rocks down there, but we'd been over them for the last sort of 4 hours. So I came up to the surface and sort of shouted, and I saw these people just swimming quite happily off towards the shore, but they were on the other side of the boat and I was on one side, and so I shouted out, "You bastards!" And then went down again, submerged, and hit another rock, this time on my lower calf, front of my calf. So I'd been bashed in two places, and I came up and then swam to the shore. And apparently, my indignation was a very good thing, because I'd gone quite a long way down for some reason. And the best way, when you come up, you just have to expel the air as quickly as possible. So my impassioned scream of abuse at these people who put me in this situation actually probably saved my life at that time, or whatever, saved me from getting not quite nastily sort of bashed around again. But I got to the shore, and it was fine, and there was a long, quite difficult walk up, which I managed to even help the crew with some of the gear. But then just that night, I got terribly stiff, and it was absolutely impossible to sleep. And a couple of days later, I got to a hospital where they x-rayed me and said, yeah, you actually cracked 2 ribs. And there's nothing you can do. You just got to carry on. They'll heal in the end. I said, I'm going to the South Pole. I said, well, bad luck. And the next shot I was doing the next day was cycling across the gorge, the Zambezi Gorge. Most stunning, extraordinary location. There was on a bike with 2 broken ribs. So if you actually look at the tape, I'm sort of moving rather gingerly all the way until we get to till I get to the South Pole. But there again, it was a moment which we didn't get on camera, and the director said, I thought rather meanly, Roger Mills said, next time you do that, make sure it's on camera. Oh, thanks, as though I meant to. But looking back, I mean, it was the only time in any of the journeys where I really did myself a serious physical injury, and we had to just keep going. And for nights, I remember it was about sort of like a couple of weeks before I could get a decent night's sleep. Crawling out of beds in various places, and we'd be on trains, sleeping on trains and all that. Not the best places to have a cracked rib. I'm quite fond of Cairo. I like it because it's, to me, the sort of essence of a good city to travel in. It's very unfamiliar, very strange, very different. The way of life there, the way, the buildings, the food, the religion, all sorts of things, are basically quite different. I mean, you see camels waiting at traffic lights and things like that. You just don't really see anywhere else. But at the same time, it's got a very, very long history. So you do feel you're in a city which has been important for thousands of years, much longer than any of the cities at home. So you've got that feeling of important events having happened there and it being at the centre of events. And I quite like the fact it's very lively. I mean, it is. I remember the traffic only moved when the light was red, because no one could ever get across in green. Just at the very end of the green light, there was a little gap, so everyone would move on the red. So the traffic lights were completely out of sync. So people only moved on the red traffic light. That was very sort of Cairene. But there's some places you are glad to be back in, and you feel you're in a sort of friendly place, and some places that are a bit threatening or a bit dull. But Cairo is neither dull nor threatening. I found it very vibrant, very exciting. Well, the globe had become a bit of a kind of icon of the journeys, and there'd be various moments when you say, Michael, it's time for a globe sequence, so to blow the globe up, and we'll sit in a train and say, we're rocking along, we're in Estonia or something like that, and only done this bit, we've got to go all that way. So it was pretty useful, and I found it useful also for sleeping on. Half inflated, it made a very good, very nice little pillow. I had to avoid sticking your head in the sea, that was the only thing, I got drenched. Anyway, it had its uses, but it was I think in the back of my mind it was becoming a bit of a cliche. And the decision to abandon it at this school in Kenya came quite spontaneously. We were revisiting this school where I'd filmed a film called The Missionary in 1981 or something like that, and there was the school building, and they used the globe to give them a little talk about my journey and all that, and just seemed a nice thing at the end to say, well, I'll give this to the school. I wanted to give them something. And I couldn't give them anything sort of that would be tangible. I would say, well, we'll give you a new door in 5 years' time or some money to build it. But the globe was there. It was a tangible thing. So I said, look, have it and learn about geography. And just as we were leaving, I could see all these children at the back of the school having a wonderful game of football with it. So, it was kind of, it may not improve their geographical skills, but I'm sure Kenya's chances in the next Africa Cup will be greatly enhanced by kicking the world around. The news that we weren't going to be able to get the boat across to Antarctica actually came through before we got to Cape Town. We knew about 2 weeks before that there were real problems. And they were trying to be very helpful, but this is a once-a-year supply ship for the South Africans. And they said, well, we got 3 berths, but we haven't got 6, or whatever it was. And, it's impossible. We need all the crew there and Basil to take the photos and all that, so and it wasn't possible to sort of split the crew at that point, so we reluctantly had to take the decision to try and get to Antarctica another way. But it spoilt everything. It spoilt all the symmetry. It spoilt going down the 30 degrees east line. It spoilt our determination to go on the surface. It spoilt what I thought could have been a really good adventure. I wasn't really looking forward to be honest, to going across the Southern Ocean, which is notorious as the roughest sea in the world. But I thought, well, this might get some interesting stuff. So disappointed on all those counts. But in the end, it turned out that our actual approach to the pole through Patriot Hills in Antarctica was still pretty good. And, the plane flight from southern Chile was as hairy, I think, as probably the boat journey would have been anyway. So there's a sense of sense of danger. As soon as it had gone out and the figures came in, and it was very good viewing figures and all that, and the book sold well. There were various people, publishers and BBC sort of documentary departments saying, how about another journey? So that happened pretty quickly. And Clem and I both said, right, let's forget it, for a year, go off and do other things. And that's exactly what we did. And although ideas did come in, we didn't really put our minds to any new project for another couple of years. And I went back, I think I wrote a novel during that period or something like that, and began work on Fierce Creatures with John Cleese and all that. But, again, you have to... There's quite a long period after making a series when I have to do publicity and go and talk about it. And you have we directors and myself will get together and say, how did that work, and what's the feeling? Have we seen this in the newspaper, or what about the figures? And then you begin to automatically to think about where might we go if we ever did another one. And but it was about a couple of years, I think, before I had the idea of going around the Pacific Rim, which became full circle. And we went off again. Fools, we just don't know when to stop.